Today is March 22nd, 2012, and we're in Hennessey, Oklahoma at the Claude Curry Family Farm. And we have Alisa Zelnicek with us today to talk about her family's farm. And my name is Tanya Finchum with Oklahoma State University Library, along with Juliana Nykolaiszyn. So thank you for having us today.
Thank you.
Let's start by having you tell us how your family came to own the land to begin with.
Okay. My great-grandfather, John Calhoun Breckenridge Curry, homesteaded the land, which is just east of Hennessey and 1.5 miles north, 8 miles east, 1.5 miles north, in the run of '89, April 22nd, 1889. He staked the claim as the Curry homestead, and 8 years later, in 1897, he paid the sum of $4 as the final payment for his quarter section of land. And in addition, there was a $1 filing fee for that. He paid 15 cents for every 100 words that appeared on the filing application, which totaled 85 cents. Thus, the amount that he paid to the government was $5.85. I found all this information out as a high school student here at Hennessey as part of my senior project. Our English teacher that year asked us to find out historical events of the Hennessey area, either of our family or just of the community. And I had done a recording of my grandfather when I was younger. My mom was an only child, so she thought it was very important to have the history of her family recorded either by word or by tape, so that as the generations moved on, that we would all have a piece of that history. And so as I think I was in middle school when I did the first recording, and then as I got older, I wrote out things, and then as a senior, I took that information and put it into a paper, and so that's what I was reading from there. So that is how our family came to get the land.
And where had he come from?
He had come from West Virginia, and then they initially settled in Kansas, and then when the run of '89 became available, then they participated in that. So they came down from the north, from Kansas, on that side.
Was he married at the time?
I don't believe he was. Let me look here at my notes. I am not sure, but I don't believe he was. Yes, because he married his wife in 1892, so he was single when he made the run.
Do you know how he came to choose that particular piece?
Yes, I do. And this is from my granddad. I learned all this from him and my grandmother. As you may know, the term Sooners was applied to people that actually came into the territory ahead of the run to figure out where they wanted to settle. And so he was a Sooner. And, there's a lot of talk about they probably weren't supposed to do that, but there was a lot of people that did that. And he chose that particular place because of the creeks and the water supply that was there. It was important to him to have a piece of land where there was a water supply for the family and for the livestock and for growing crops. And so that is why they chose that
And some of his early crops were?
Mostly wheat.
at that age stage?
Mm-hmm.
Any cotton?
Not that is recorded or that we remembered. It was mostly wheat. And then, of course, they had, vegetables and things to sustain their family.
It was 160 acres.
It was 120 acres, a quarter section. Well, that's 160, that's correct.
Mm-hmm.
And there's 80 acres in cultivation. And the rest of the land is pasture area, and always has been. The way it's set up now, he initially, the north 40 acres, where the dugout is near, is what he cultivated first. And then as the years went on and they were able to cultivate more land, then they moved over to the big area. Actually, that's 20 acres on the north side. And then the rest of the 60 acres came later into cultivation. And then the south side, the creek on the south side, and on the south side of the creek has always been pasture land. And there is actually buffalo wallers evident in that area, in that part of the land. And you can actually see those. Of course, they were more evident when I was a child, but you can still see them on satellite imagery of that part of the property.
Okay, talk us through how it came down through the people, different generations to you.
Okay.
So
So my great-grandfather is the one that homesteaded it. In 1892, he married Mary Eva Boos, Boos, and they had their children. My grandfather was the third child, and he was named after his father, John, but his middle name was Claude, John Claude Curry, and he was always called Claude. He said he doesn't ever remember being called John unless he was in trouble, and then his mother would say, John Claude. So, and then we called him Granddad. So, he had a brother, and we called him Gene. I think his first name was actually Eugene. Let me put that up here real quick. And he had a sister. And his mother, Mary Eva Boos, was also from the Kansas area. Okay, and they had 5 children. Ralph Ollie Curry, so R.O. is what he went by. And then Alma Elizabeth Curry was his sister. And then the third child was my grandfather. And then his younger brother was Roy Dewey Curry. And then the youngest was James Eugene Curry, and that's Gene. That's my mom's uncle Gene. When my great-grandfather, he died in 1918 there on the farm, and of course left the land to his wife, Mary, and she died in 1934. And then the land went to the children. Eventually, there was a little bit of dispute between the children about who was going to get the land. And unfortunately, my grandfather, the dispute was between the older children and him. And so he did not have a lot to do with them as an older adult. But after he came back from serving in the Navy, he worked several different farms, and the older son, Ralph Ollie Curry, actually lived on the farm after the parents died. But eventually, because of that dispute, they went to court, and I've got some of that documents here, and I'm not quite sure what the dispute was about. I'm sure it was about the land, but eventually the land then went to my grandfather, Claude, and his brother, Gene, the youngest, James Eugene. And I believe they bought out the other children's portion. And then my uncle Gene, he moved back east. He became a physician. And so he moved back east and lived most of his life in Connecticut. And so he sold the land eventually to my grandfather. And so eventually it was all in my grandfather's name. And he farmed the land until he was an older gentleman. They actually they had several farms. They had that one that they owned, the homestead, and then he rented several farms in the Kingfisher and Logan County area. And they lived on the farm that they rented out at the county line, which is Kingfisher and Logan County line, which is 12 miles east on Highway 51. There was a house there on the corner. And that's where, as a child, I remember going to see my grandparents. They did live on the homestead for a short time, but because that house and barn had been there for so many years, it was a little dilapidated. And so they ended up moving into the house on one of the farms that they rented. And as he got older, then he asked my father to come and help him farm. Both of my parents, George Chanley Duell and Marilyn Curry Duell, she was the only daughter, or the only child of my grandparents. And so they were both teachers. They both graduated from OSU. And my dad actually has a master's from there also. And he was in the military. And so when they taught and lived in Oklahoma most of their lives, except for the time that he served overseas in the occupation after World War II of Germany. They lived there for several years. So when my grandfather got older and couldn't or didn't want to farm full time, my dad quit teaching and we moved here. And that was he actually helped. We would come here in the summers and actually help with the harvest all of my childhood. And then when I was in 5th grade, my dad quit teaching and we moved here to Hennessey and he took over the farm full time. My grandfather still assisted him, especially during harvest. And then my dad's father helped too. They're from Marshall. And my mom, since she was the only child, when my grandparents passed away, the farm went to her. And my parents are both deceased now, and they left the farm in a trust. And the trust is meant to carry on for 100 years after their death, so that it stays in the family. And they've set it up very well where the income from the oil well and the income that the farm generates will actually be used to pay the property taxes and the upkeep of the farm. And it will eventually go to an heir of my brother, Mike Duell. And so they wanted to make sure that homestead stayed in the family, and so they set it up that way. I hope that answered your question.
That's great. Sure.
That was a lot of information, or a lot of talking. I don't know if it was information, but.
So on the property, on the homestead property today, what buildings are still there?
There's really not anything. There's a corral, of course, that my dad had built when he was farming because he had cattle and horses there. There is still some parts of the barn that are there, but the house was, that they cleared that area as the house fell. I remember the house vaguely, so it must have been taken down when I was very young. I wish I had that date, but I don't think I do. So,
well, when you would help with the harvest, what would you do?
As a young child, I just helped with the meal preparation, helped my mom prepare meals, and kind of hung out rode in the truck to take the wheat to the elevator. As I got older, then I worked. I either drove a wheat truck or drove a tractor. I never drove the combine. I would ride in the combine, but the combine was something that only the older men could do, and my brother as he got older. But I was more of an outdoor person, so I helped with the meals, but as I got older, I wanted to be out doing things with the men, with my dad and my granddad. And so I did a lot of driving the wheat truck and driving the tractor.
Wheat elevator here in Hennessey or a different one?
We usually took our wheat to Marshall. And then as things progressed, like when my husband was farming, we took it either to Marshall or Bison. So we didn't always use the Hennessey elevator. The reasoning that my dad gave me and my granddad gave me was that the lines were always too long in Hennessey. So, and because my parents were both raised in Marshall, they had a strong tie to that. And my dad's parents still lived there. And so that was kind of home to them. And so they wanted to, use the Marshall elevator because that's where their home had been.
About how far is that from here, Marshall?
It is straight east. It is 15 miles. There's a turnoff there, and it's 2 miles to the north. And there's still a little town there. There's not a lot of people that live there anymore, but there's still a little town there.
Well, when they would do their shopping, like to get other types of groceries and things, which town would they go to?
Marshall. Mm-hmm. When we lived out there. And in the summers, when my dad still taught, and we would come in the summers to help with harvest, we would live in 1962, the year I was born. My grandparents actually built a house here in Hennessey. It's over on Manning Drive. And so they moved from the farm to town. My grandmother wanted to live in town. And so they built a house, and they paid cash for it. That was a big thing for my parents and my grandparents. They did not like debt. And so they always saved and paid cash for things, which is completely opposite of the way most people do things now. But, and so in 1962, they moved to town. And so in the summers, when we would help with harvest, we actually lived out on the house at that 12-mile county line house where my grandparents had lived. That was a farm that we rented and farmed for years and years. It wasn't until my dad got unable to farm that we finally gave that up, So, in the original owners, which that was the Staten place, they sold it, and the people that live there now have owned it since then.
Well, did your grandmother have a large garden?
She did, yes. She always did, and my granddad loved gardening too. Strawberries and tomatoes were the key things for them. And they even had a large garden in their backyard here at Hennessey.
They did a lot of canning and preserving.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Did that place have a cellar?
Mm-hmm. It did.
Strong cellar.
Yeah. Yeah, both the places. The place on the homestead did, as well as the place on the 12-mile where they lived. I remember as a child being out there in the summers for harvest. Basically what happened was when school ended in May, we moved. We lived in Hennessey in the summer, or lived on the farm in the summer. And it was like that until we moved here permanently. And I remember several times going to the storm cellar out there because of tornadoes. We had one tornado out there that hit the barn, and there were several barns on that property, but it hit one of the barns, and we were in the storm cellar when that hit. I can't remember how old I was, but I was in elementary school. I remember that because I wrote a paper about it when I went back to school in the fall. And you know how the teachers would say, well, write a paper about what you did this summer. And mine was about being on the farm and having the tornado, and it was so fun because my dad would hire some of his students to come and help with harvest in the summer. And this was when we were living at Ringwood. And he was coach also, so he, knew a lot of the boys that were strong and, needed a summer job. And there were several that came and lived there on the farm with us, or more during the summers with us. And they did that for several summers. And one of Mom's favorite stories was that 2 of the boys loved pancakes. And breakfast was the biggest meal of the day, usually, because that's when they were still there at the house. And so she, one of the first mornings that summer when these boys were living with us, she made pancakes. And they just kept eating and eating and asking for more. And finally, my mom says, I don't have any more batter. I don't have enough. You've run me out of milk and eggs and flour. And, now I'm going to have to go to the store so I have stuff for tomorrow. And that was one of her favorite stories, was that the boys that Dad brought to help with harvest had such a ferocious appetite that they ate everything that first morning of the summer because they were just so hungry. So, and then we would usually make sandwiches for lunch and take that to the field. And we had water coolers that were aluminum. I don't know if you remember seeing those, but you know how now they're the plastic got. Well, these were all aluminum. And you would get your blocks of ice, and you'd break up that block, and so it would fit down in the cooler, and then you would put your water on top of that, and they would take that with them to the field. And we had several, and that would have to last them, the day for the water. And we had a pump there outside of that house, and we'd go out and the actual pump, and you'd go out and you'd pump the water out and fill the cooler up and put it in the back of the pickup for them, and off they'd go. And then at lunch we would take the sandwiches out to them, and we usually had sandwiches and fruit. And then at dinner time, it was always late after it got dark, and they would come back to the house, and we'd have a bigger meal in the evening. So breakfast and dinner were there at the house, and the sandwiches we took to them for lunch.
Well, did they have chickens?
Yes, we had chickens, yeah. And, my dad loved animals and farming, even though he was a teacher, as, that was his profession. We always had animals. At Ringwood, there was one house we lived in, and it was a small town, so you could have animals and stuff, but it had several barns. He incubated chickens, and we had a lot of chickens there, and he would sell the chickens. We had rabbits. Our neighbors behind us had goats, and they would give us goat's milk, which I hated. My dad didn't really like it either, but, there was a neighbor, and they were giving it to you, so you used it. And we never had goats. Goats were not, but we always had chickens, pigs, rabbits, cattle, horses. My brother and I both were active in 4-H and FFA, and we showed animals all through elementary school and high school. My brother actually went to college on a scholarship of livestock judging, and he graduated from OSU as well. So, and I went there for a year, but then decided I wanted to be a nurse, so I transferred to the nursing school.
No, we don't have nursing. Well, do you remember if your grandmother participated in home demonstration clubs?
Yes, yes, and my mother too.
Even though she taught?
Yeah, she was a home ec teacher.
Oh, okay.
So
I would explain that then.
Yeah, and until 2010 when she had her stroke, she was still active in the Farmerettes Club here. There was another club that they, kind of a home demonstration club, CWF. She was active in a lot of clubs like that. My grandmother was too. Farmerettes, and they're still active here in Hennessey. If you look in the Hennessey Clipper, there's usually a little article about the Farmerettes, where they met this week and that type of thing. So,
Did your grandmother quilt?
my mother did not. My grandmother did, and I have a lot of her quilts. And my great grandmother did, and I have some of her quilts. My mother was an avid seamstress, but quilting was never, I can't say that she never quilted, but that was not her main thing that she liked to do. She sewed a lot of clothes for us. My grandmother and my mom, I remember having more clothes as a child made than I ever bought. Now, of course, when I got into high school, I wanted clothes from the store. And Easter and the start of school were the 2 times a year when we got new shoes and a new dress. So usually they made our dresses, but as I got older, I remember going to Enid and getting to shop for a dress. So
Since we're a little bit on Easter, were there other holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving? How were those celebrated?
usually just a family gathering at my grandparents' house here in Hennessey, and both my mom and my grandmother were wonderful cooks. My grandmother was especially good with pies and everything, really, and so that was a big treat for us to get to go over there and have homemade rolls and homemade pie, and just everything that you could imagine that was good. So
Her last name was Boos?
that was my great grandmother. Yes.
Wonder where they had come from initially.
They were from Kansas also.
But even prior to
I don't know. I do know. She was born in Iowa. So, in 1863.
they were probably used to farming there too.
Yeah. And then my great-grandfather was born in Ravenwood, West Virginia in 1854. And then they both died on the farm.
You want to talk a little bit more about the house that you remember as a child going to? Indoor
Sure.
plumbing, electricity,
Sure,
that type of thing.
It was a 2-story white frame house, a really big house. It had a nice big front porch that faced Highway 51, faced south. I remember one summer we were living there and we were all asleep in the middle of the night. There was this terrible racket. We all jumped up and went downstairs. We slept upstairs. My parents slept downstairs. But we went downstairs and a truck that was driving by on Highway 51 had a blowout, and that tire had come through the front window. And fortunately, the window that it came through was the living room and not my parents' bedroom, because they slept right by that window. We had no air conditioning in the summer. Of course, growing up, until we moved into this house, we never had central heat and air. We moved here in 1980. We had water coolers, but out at the farm in the summers, we didn't have any type of air conditioning or cooler. We had fans. And my favorite fan was a round circular fan that sat on the floor, and the air went out, from all sides. And I would play like Tea Party and things like that on top of that because it was cool. It kept you cool. And summers were hot out there, as you can imagine, Oklahoma. So, and as I got older, one of the treats that I would get before I started working on the farm was my grandparents would come and get me and bring me into Hennessey to the pool. They had a swimming pool, and we never lived anywhere that had a swimming pool. And so we would come into town as an occasional treat and get to go swimming. So.
Well, were there ponds on the original on the homestead?
Mm-hmm.
You go swimming in those?
Well, we waded in the creeks. Yeah, we didn't really swim in the ponds. Dad didn't feel like that was safe, and it wasn't a very big pond. The creeks were the main water source there.
Had they built the ponds, or were they natural?
I think it was natural. It's not there anymore. It was on the north side of the farm. Now, the house where they lived, there at the 12-mile intersection, that had a big pond in the back, but he didn't let us swim in that because, not safe.
Well, did they do any terracing on the homestead?
Yes, my dad did. He terraced that place, hired someone that was an expert in that, and they came out and terraced the homestead so that it would promote the drainage. Yeah, promote the drainage, yeah. So.
Do you have a favorite memory?
There's so many.
Any mischief?
Well, I had a lot of broken bones as a child. I was telling this to one of my patients not that long ago. I'm afraid of heights now, but as a child, I like to jump off of things. And so we had a cow tank that was right beside the barn. And I thought it might be fun to pretend like that was my swimming pool. And, it wasn't good enough just to play around in it. So I decided to climb on the roof of the barn and jump. And I can't remember what I broke, but I broke something. And then, I was just always a little bit of a klutz, falling off things or jumping off things and things like that. So, but I think one of my favorite memories is probably harvest in the summer and the interaction with my grandparents, both my dad's parents and my mom's parents, because it was really a family event all summer, fixing the meals and during the school year we didn't get to see them very much. And so that was kind of a special event because you got to, and then to come to my grandparents' house in Hennessey was a real treat because they had central air conditioning and they had a swimming pool in town, and my granddad, he made homemade ice cream, and I got to be the one to sit on it while he cranked it, and he made popcorn at night for me, and I sometimes would come into town and spend the night with them, and so it was kind of like a big slumber party and summer event.
Well, you mentioned chunks of ice. Did you have to have an ice plant, or what were the chunks of ice?
They went to Marshall and got the ice. There was somewhere in Marshall that you could go buy big
Blocks.
chunks of ice. Yeah. So I can't remember where, but I remember my mom. We've got the ice in the back, back of the pickup. You boys go get it. And so.
And did that place have home and indoor plumbing?
It did have indoor plumbing, I'm sorry. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now, early, when my grandparents first lived there, it did not. There was an outhouse, and it was back behind the house. There was a large cottonwood tree, and it was still there when I was a kid, but they didn't use it. They had plumbed the house. So.
Good old days.
Yeah.
How was the house heated? With wood or
yes,
propane or?
Eventually it was propane, but there was a wood stove in there. We were never here in the winters. And my grandparents moved to town in 62, the year I was born, so I don't really remember much about that. I wish I had written more of that down.
Was church a
Yes.
vital part of
Yes, it was. Yes.
They would come into Marshall or Hennessey?
Well, at first, they went to Marshall, and then when they moved to town, they became members of the Christian church here, and they were members there from 62 until they passed away. And when we moved to Hennessey, we joined that church too. So.
And then Sunday afternoons, anything special going on there?
Food. Sunday church dinner, dinner after church was kind of the big meal of the week.
And usually what would they have?
Roast or fried chicken. My grandmother made the best fried chicken. So, and homemade rolls. And I've still got that recipe. I don't make them, but I need to.
Well, if you didn't come at during the winter, you wouldn't have come at Christmas?
I did come at, we did spend Christmas and Thanksgiving with my grandparents. My dad's parents, from the time I can remember, after he retired from Champlin in Enid, they lived in Marshall. But in the winter, they would go to South Texas. So,
snowbirds.
Yes, and they had a travel trailer. At first it was just a camper on the back of a pickup, and then they got a travel trailer, and they were always gone during Christmas and Thanksgiving down there. So we always spent the holiday with my mom's parents here in Hennessey.
So as far as you know, your great-grandfather didn't do anything but farm. Didn't have a job off the farm.
I'm pretty sure that's... No, not that I think that's all.
And then your grandfather, did he?
He farmed, he worked as a cowboy, and there's one story, and I've got a picture where he was working on cattle drives, and they would drive cattle as far north as Nebraska, and then come back this direction. And he worked on the Bar X Ranch near Hennessey for almost 3 years. That's my great-grandfather worked on the Bar X Ranch near Hennessey. And that's how he knew of this area, and that's how he knew to look in this area for the land.
Just trying to figure out if they had to do supplemental income in order to...
Right. I think it was mostly, animals, cattle and things like that, but I think farming was the main source of income for them.
And then your great-grandmother and your grandmother didn't work outside the home?
No. Actually, my grandmother did get her teaching certificate at the Teachers College which was where UCO is now. But she didn't teach. She taught at Lone Star School, and they're actually doing there's a gentleman from Hennessey, Richard Simonek, that's working on a book about Lone Star, and that's Lone Star School was actually where my mother went to elementary school, and it was out east near that 12-mile section where my grandparents lived and my mother was raised. So there was a school, and she would walk to Lone Star to go to school. And my grandmother taught there. So.
1 room, 2 room?
The 1 room school. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, do you have a first tractor story? Who taught you how to drive the tractor?
My dad and my grandfather taught me. So that was a big deal to get to drive anything, a pickup truck, a wheat truck, a tractor, because it showed that they trusted you to do that.
Before you were 16?
Is that somebody walking by? Yes, before I was 16. Yeah. And that was typical. You know, you work if you worked on the farm, you didn't drive on the road, but you drove in the fields and that type of thing. So, I
Had
think
to learn how to change gears then. I would
yes,
say.
yes. One of the probably most memorable events of working in the field was I was in high school and my brother would have been, he's 5 years younger than I am, so he would have been in middle school. And we were living here then, and they did swath, crops for hay. And so I was driving the swather on that 12-mile farm, and my brother was in the farm we rented across the road on the tractor. And it was one of those days where it was hot, and being a teenage girl, the swather didn't have a cab on it, so I thought, well, this will be a great way to get a tan. So I wore what we called back then a tube top with under my overalls, but I had a t-shirt on over so my dad wouldn't know. But when I got out there and got on the swather, I took the t-shirt off and just undid the overall straps so I wouldn't have strap lines. And I had taken water with me, but I was not really drinking a whole lot of water. I was just kind of focused on the task and thinking about what teenage girls, whatever I was thinking about. And all of a sudden I felt really dizzy and lightheaded, and so I knew I better stop. And so I stopped the swather, turned it off, and as I was climbing down off of it, I passed out. Well, my brother, he was not old enough to drive a car. He was in middle school, but he saw that the swather had stopped, and he's on the farm next door just going around in the tractor, disking or plowing. And he watched and didn't see me walking around, and the swather didn't start back up, and he knew something was wrong. So he stopped the tractor, got off and ran across the road and found me. And he pulled me into a shaded area and got some water in me. I woke up enough to drink. He said, drink some water, he said. And then he ran and got the car that we had driven out. I had driven him out. I had a driver's license then, and we had driven out to the farm in, and he drove that car out into the field, got me in the car, and he was small, and he said that he was so scared driving back to Hennessey, and he couldn't see over the steering wheel, so he was having to pull himself up to see where he was going, and he knew he didn't want to drive on the highway, so he drove the back roads all the way in. And we got to the house. We didn't live here then. We lived here in town, but we lived on another street in a house. And my mom was home, and he ran into the house and got my mom, and they got me into the bathtub and got me in the water, and so I was fine. But it's just one of those things as a teenager that you do, thinking, oh, I'm going to get a tan, I'm going to get my work done, earn some brownie points with my parents, getting all that done, and it'd be a great day. And then it ends up my brother kind of saves my life,
And that sunburn, say.
Do what?
Sunburn too?
Yeah, sunburn
On top of
too,
that.
heat stroke.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Would they generally wear a hat or protection from the
Yes,
sun?
and that was always a big thing. Make sure you put your hat on, when you're out there. And of course, I didn't have a hat on, and so.
Well, you mentioned that you were quite adventurous as a kid, and you had lots of broken bones. And did your family have any home remedies when you get sick or get bee stung?
One of the main things I remember, what's the name of it? It was It was a liquid. Campho-phenique was what we used for mosquito bites and things like that. But there was, on cuts and scrapes, I think it was called mercurochrome. Is that right?
Burn like crazy. wasn't it?
Yes. But it had a little glass dropper that came when you took the cap off, and then you put that dropper on the cut, and it was red, if I remember correctly. But yes, it would burn. But that was supposed to disinfect and help with healing. And then there was an ointment that my grandmother always had for burns. You know, like if you burn when we were cooking chicken, you know, as you were learning, you always got burned because you put the chicken in too hot of an oil or things like that. So she had an ointment that she made up that she put on burns. So,
Speaking of chickens, did you have to help butcher any?
yes.
Well, that leads me to a question I like to ask. I think everybody has a different technique. What was the technique in your family?
Wringing their necks.
You'd be surprised at how many different methods
It
there
was-
are.
To me, it was very brutal. I didn't like that. But it was
It's just
Yeah,
part of life.
just part of
wasn't it?
life. I loved watching the incubator, watching the eggs hatch in the incubator. That was so fun. And then when we had all those little chicks, you know, it was neat. So
Did they encourage your brother to learn how to use the BB gun and rifle and that type of thing?
no, my dad was not a big hunter. So no, my brother doesn't really, not real big into guns. Now my husband, that's another story. My husband and son, they love guns. And my grandparents, my dad's parents, had several guns that they passed on to him, and that we have now. So
Are your great grandparents and your grandparents buried here in Hennessey or Marshall?
Marshall, yes, everyone's out at the North Marshall Cemetery, which is several miles north of Marshall. That road that comes off 51 that goes into Marshall, you keep going north 2 miles, and then it's half a mile back to the west, and it's called the North Marshall Lions Cemetery.
Interesting name.
And we still donate to that, and I plan to do that all my life to help with the upkeep of it. And my mom, she was very generous in that. They had some bricks left over from building this house, and so she donated that and the labor to build a entry fence there at the cemetery with the brick pillar and then the metal fence. And there's 2 entrances there that she had done. So that was very important to her. Cemeteries, visiting the cemetery, flowers at Memorial Day and 4th of July and Christmas was always, and then on the date of their birthday and that type of thing was always very important to my mom. Even, you know, after my dad passed away, there's pictures of her and some of the church ladies, and they would, you know, go out and decorate. They called it decorating the grave. And I remember as a kid, she kept back in that closet in their bedroom boxes of artificial flowers, and you know, there was the ones that she put out on Memorial Day, and the ones at 4th of July, and the ones on their birthday, and the ones at Christmas. So that was a big event. In this last year on Memorial Day, my mom had just passed away, and so I came back, and several of her cousins were in town because their families are buried out there as well. And so we had a lunch out at my mother's cousin's house, which she still lives east of Hennessey. And they were all, you know, my cousins were there. Got to visit with them. And Memorial Days was always people came to mom and dad's house, because this was the closest thing to the Marshall Cemetery, and my mom would cook and we'd have a meal and they'd all go to the cemetery.
Tradition.
Tradition, yeah.
Well, you mentioned building this house. Did they have any reason why they didn't build on the homestead place if they were going to build anyway?
Well, my mom didn't want to live out in the country.
Town.
She wanted to live in town. So, and she taught here at Hennessey, and so it just kind of made sense, because once my brother started school, then she went back to teaching, and she taught here for about 30 years. And so it just kind of made sense, at least to my parents, to build here in town or live here in town. And we rented several houses here in Hennessey before we built this. So the year I graduated, April of 1980, we moved here into this house. I graduated in May and left to go to Stillwater in August. So it was kind of a big year, because my parents had a new house. But this is where I always came back to, in the summer, so, to visit holidays and things.
Well, it seems like education was an important part of
It
the
was
family
very
too.
important.
Teaching to.
Yes. And when my husband and I had our kids, I told him, I said, I don't know how my parents did it, but they never told me I had to go to college. But I knew that I would go to college. And so it was just something that, they never told us that we had to. But I think because we saw that their education was important to them, and I think it just was instilled in you. So my sister and my brother and I, we all are college graduates. My sister and I are both nurses, and my brother, he has a degree in agriculture, but he doesn't, that's not his profession. He has an insurance agency in Tennessee. He lives in Memphis.
And each one of you have children?
Mm-hmm. My sister has 2 children. She's the oldest, and her children are grown. And then I have 2 children. We both had a boy and a girl. And then my brother, he has a little boy that is 6, and they actually lost their first child. He was born with a heart defect, and he lived 14 months and then passed away. So they had their second child is all they have.
The reason I asked him, you mentioned that it would be his children that get to carry on the
Yes.
farm, even though then you and your sister both had sons.
Right.
Children too, so.
But they wanted it in the dual name. They wanted someone with the name of dual to have it. So, and that's fine.
Sure.
That, and my parents told us that years and years ago. I mean, I remember that my whole life. They had a plan, and this is what the plan was. And, it was not our right to question that plan, or, that's what they wanted. So.
And I noticed the name for the farm today is the Claude Curry,
Mm-hmm.
rather than
Yes.
his father's. Was there
Right.
what went into your decision to do that?
Well, I think when my grandfather bought out his brothers and sisters, that dispute and the land became his is when they named it that.
Okay. That would,
And then when the Centennial Farm, recognition came about, well, we had to choose a name, and so that.
and your parents were the ones that chose at that point.
Yeah, my grandparents too. I mean, they were part of that decision, but I remember that was a big event to
And
get that.
family farm versus ranch or homestead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, significance there too.
Right.
Is there anything you want to tell us that I haven't asked about? Did the house have a porch? You're the one that you remember as a child had a porch.
Yes, we always sat out on the porch in the evenings because that's where the breeze was the best. And so after that evening meal in the summer, we'd sit out there. And my mom and dad were both avid readers, and I am too. So reading was a big part. Going to the Hennessey library was a big deal for me, because where we lived at that time in Ringwood, we didn't have a library. We had a library at the school, but not a true library, and it was a real treat. I was always in the summers part of the summer reading program here. And then an additional treat was to go to Enid to the big library. So
Well, I noticed the one in town now is in the old high school.
it is.
Where was it before that?
It was on this north end of town. The building's gone now, but where the park is on Main Street, there was a building there, and that's where it was.
Smaller, but still wanted.
Oh,
Still a
but the
library.
smell was so wonderful. You walk in there and you smell those books. And I would be there for hours. You know, Grandma, if, it was a rainy day and we were working, or when I was young enough and I didn't work on the farm, she'd go and drop me off at the library, and while she went to get groceries and run her errands and things.
Safe enough to do it in those days.
I love the library. I still do. Still love to go to the library and just look at the books. And
Smell. So when was the last time you walked all 160 acres?
a long time ago. Yeah.
It's walkable though, is
Yeah.
it?
It
Are
is.
there any fences
Mhm.
from?
Yes,
I
my
mean,
parents.
older ones too.
No, my parents updated all the fences when they were still alive, and so they updated all the fences, so they're pretty well. Yeah, I know that was a big thing that my parents saved for, was they were saving money for several years to have good fences put in.
Well, the old fences, do you have any information about them?
I just remember they were, pieces of wood and strands of barbed wire. Because I remember my dad taking all that down, And he had a scar on his chest from out at the homestead before we moved here, he was helping my granddad load cattle. And somehow he got thrown into the fence or fell into the fence. It was an old barbed wire fence, and it cut his chest open there, and he had to have stitches, and he always had that scar. But that was, even though he's in the military, he's like, the only scar I ever got was out there running cattle with your granddad on that fence.
Oh.
So
Well, it's good memories.
yes, it was.
If there's anything else, we'll say
Okay.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, me too.